has finally burned out. Once you understand how it was lit, why it continued to smolder, and what finally led it to the powder keg, the entire situation takes on a completely new perspective.
Now to the ABC News exclusive tonight after Donald Trump was fined nearly $355 million in his civil fraud case. Tonight, New York State's Attorney General Letitia James saying she's prepared to seize Donald Trump's assets, including his buildings, if he doesn't pay the money. ABC's Aaron Katersky one-on-one tonight with the Attorney General.
4 days after a judge ordered Donald Trump to pay $355 million for a decade of fraud, New York Attorney General Letitia James says she's prepared to do everything she can to make sure the former president pays his fine, including, she told us, seizing the buildings that bear his name.
Let's break down what actually happened. A New York judge ruled that Donald Trump engaged in persistent financial fraud over roughly a decade. The case focused on how Trump and the Trump Organization reported the value of key assets, like Trump Tower, Mar-a-Lago, and several golf courses, on financial statements used to secure loans and insurance. According to the court, those values were routinely inflated, sometimes dramatically, giving Trump a financial advantage. Judge Arthur Engoron didn't just issue a warning, he imposed a massive civil penalty of about $355 million, plus interest, pushing the total toward the mid-$400 million range. That number is critical because in New York, to appeal a civil judgment and pause enforcement during the appeal, you typically need to post a bond covering the full amount. That's where the tension began. Trump immediately said he would appeal. His lawyers sounded confident, and publicly, he insisted he had ample funds, claimed the case was unfair, said the banks were fine, and argued no one was harmed. But behind the scenes, a very specific clock started ticking. Without that bond, the judgment wasn't just theoretical, it was enforceable. Enter New York Attorney General Letitia James, whose involvement shifted the entire tone of this story.
Have funds to pay off the judgment, then we will seek, judgment enforcement mechanisms in court, and we will ask the judge to seize his assets.
Trump was held liable for exaggerating his wealth and inflating the value of his real estate so banks would give him low-interest loans. Trump insisted the banks liked doing business with him.
They said no victim, no one got harmed, the banks got paid back. So no harm, no foul. Why is that not the case in your view?
So financial frauds are not victimless crimes. He engaged in this massive amount of fraud, and it wasn't just a simple mistake, a slight oversight. The variations were wildly exaggerated, and the extent of the fraud was staggering.
James didn't just file the lawsuit years ago, and she didn't just win. After the judgment, she made it unmistakably clear, in interviews, on camera, in plain language, that if Trump didn't pay or post the bond, her office was ready to enforce it. That meant seizing assets, not hypothetically, not someday, but for real. That mattered because Trump's entire public identity is built around wealth, leverage, and control. For decades, he used real estate not just as property, but as symbols of power and tools for financial influence. Buildings in Trump's world aren't just structures, they're collateral, branding, leverage with banks, proof of strength. So when James said his buildings could be seized if he didn't comply, it hit differently. This wasn't just about money, it was about control. The reactions online split immediately. Supporters framed it as political persecution, insisting the case punished Trump's politics, not his business practices. They leaned on his core defense. The banks were repaid, the loans performed, so where's the harm? Critics saw something very different, a rare moment when someone with enormous wealth and influence was being treated like any other defendant. Lose the case, pay the judgment, or the state enforces it. Here's what most people miss. Civil fraud doesn't require a victim to go bankrupt. Legally, the harm comes from deception. Inflating asset values to secure better loans or insurance changes the risk for lenders and insurers. Even if the loans are repaid, the system itself is distorted. That's why regulators take it seriously. James emphasized that this wasn't a small typo or a one-time mistake, it was a pattern of repeated exaggerations. Numbers shifted depending on what benefited Trump in the moment. High values for loans, lower values for taxes. From James' perspective, this wasn't a close call. Here's where things get interesting. When the judgment came down, Trump faced a very real logistical problem. Posting a bond of that size isn't as simple as writing a check, even for someone wealthy. Bond companies usually require collateral, cash, assets they can claim if the appeal fails. Trump's team publicly said they were working on it, that talks were underway, that a solution was coming, but days turned into weeks and the bond never materialized. Meanwhile, Letitia James wasn't bluffing. She reminded everyone that under New York law, if a judgment isn't secured, the state can enforce it. That means filing liens, freezing accounts, and seeking court orders to seize property. Notice what she didn't say. She didn't say she wanted to. She said she was prepared to. That distinction matters. This wasn't political theater. It was a legal warning. Strategically, it put Trump in a corner. Post the bond, and enormous resources are tied up. Don't post it, and he risks losing control of assets central to both his business and public image. That's why legal commentators started paying attention, not to the headline number, but to what enforcement would actually look like. Asset seizure doesn't mean bulldozers arrive overnight. It's procedural and methodical. The state goes to court, identifies judgment-linked assets, and seeks authority to take control or force a sale. Once it starts, it's hard to stop. Trump's response escalated on social media. He framed the situation as unprecedented, accused James of corruption and racism, and described the judgment as election interference. From his perspective, it was existential. But judges rule on compliance, not politics. Appeals don't automatically pause enforcement. Bonds do. When James talked about seizing assets, she wasn't inventing a punishment. She was describing the system's default mechanism. Most people miss this because most people never lose a civil fraud case involving hundreds of millions. Now, zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Trump is facing multiple legal battles at once, civil cases, criminal cases, and investigations across different jurisdictions. Legal defense at that scale costs a fortune. Lawyers don't work for free. Appeals aren't cheap. Bonds require collateral. Financial flexibility matters. So when Letitia James threatened enforcement, it wasn't just about this one judgment. It was about leverage across all fronts. If assets get tied up, accounts frozen, or properties can't be refinanced or used as collateral, everything becomes more difficult. That's where the real tension came from. Some analysts believe James understood that perfectly, that the goal wasn't spectacle, but pressure, to force compliance, payment, or consequences. Others argue she was simply doing her job, enforcing the law when a defendant refuses to secure a judgment. Both interpretations can be true at the same time. Culturally, this moment landed hard. For decades, Trump built an image of someone who always wins, always escapes, always finds a loophole. Bankruptcies became rebrands. Lawsuits became delays. Critics gave up. Deals got renegotiated. This case disrupted that pattern. A judge found him liable, and the state's top law enforcement officer publicly warned that consequences would be enforced like any other case. No exemptions, no special treatment. Whether you support Trump or not, that's seismic. Online reactions reflected the shock. Some cheered, saying accountability had finally arrived. Others panicked, warning that if it can happen to Trump, it can happen to anyone. But this didn't happen overnight. It followed years of investigation, a full trial, extensive evidence, and a detailed judicial ruling. Here's the twist most people miss. Shortly after the pressure peaked, an appeals court reduced the bond requirement to $175 million while the appeal proceeds. Trump posted that bond, pausing enforcement. This changed the immediate outcome, but it didn't erase the underlying judgment. It didn't overturn the fraud finding or declare Trump innocent. It simply adjusted the terms while higher courts review the case. Where does that leave things? Trump is still appealing a massive fraud judgment. Letitia James is still positioned to enforce it if the appeal fails. Trump's finances remain under a microscope, and the message is clear. Wealth may delay consequences, but it doesn't always erase them. This wasn't the end of the story. It was a turning point, a moment when the abstract idea of accountability became concrete. Buildings, money, and control were at stake, and regardless of how the appeal concludes, the signal has been sent, the rules apply, enforcement mechanisms are real, and the myth of invulnerability took a hit. That's why this moment matters more than the headline number. Once the conversation shifts from "could this happen?" to "this is how it happens," everything feels different.